Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. So good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this fourth program in the series in Adirondacks for All, Identity and Environmental Justice in the North Country, jointly presented by the Adirondack Experience, the Adirondack Diversity Initiative, the Wild Center, and the Nature Conservancy. This series has worked to examine the history and the present-day reality of the Adirondacks through an expansive lens of environmental justice. To this end, previous programs have explored whose stories are being told when we celebrate multi-generational attachment to Adirondack land and water, how diverse communities, including Indigenous peoples and African Americans, found meaning and inspiration from the Adirondacks region. Tonight, our panelists will explore women that settled the North Country and ran households, farms, and social movements, all of which actively shaped the Adirondack environment and community. I'm Eric Reardon, Project Director, and I'd like to start this evening's program by acknowledging that the Adirondack Experience is situated on the Aboriginal territories of the Mohawk and Abenaki people. Indigenous people continue to live in this region and practice their teachings and lifeways. This program, titled Women in the Forest of History, Renderings of Adirondack Wilderness, features presentations from Robin Caudell and Sandra Weber. Robin Caudell is an award-winning staff writer for the Press Republican newspaper in Plattsburgh, where she has worked since 1990. Robin holds a BS in journalism from the University of Maryland at College Park and an MFA in creative writing from Goddard College. She's a Cave Canem Poet, North Country Underground Railroad Historical Association trustee, and founding member of the Plattsburgh Air Force Base Museum. A Cold War veteran and SAC warrior, Sergeant Caudell was stationed at Plattsburgh Air Force Base, where she was the recipient of the John L. Levitow Award, Non-Commissioned Officer Leadership School. She recently received the 2002 Women of Distinction Military Service Award from New York State Assemblyman Billy Jones. Since living in the Adirondacks, her diverse research projects explore the Underground Railroad and the Black experience in the Adirondacks. Sandra Weber is an independent researcher and writer specializing in Adirondack history and women's history. For more than 30 years, she's been researching, portraying, and writing about women and their relationship with the Adirondack landscape. Breaking Trail, Remarkable Women of the Adirondacks, which she co-authored with Peggy Lynn in 2004, profiled the lives of 25 women. Several of Sandra's other books, such as Mount Marcy, convey a sense of place by exploring the human and natural history of a specific site in microscopic detail. More recently, Sandra has studied the women's suffrage movement and the importance of commemoration. She wrote The Women's Suffrage Statue and edited the Champlain Valley Suffrage Centennial Auto Tour. Throughout this evening's presentation, please feel free to submit any questions you may have through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And at this point, I will now turn the program over to Robin Caudell.
Good evening, everyone. So I'm also going to do a mini land acknowledgement in a way, and I'm going to share a short tribute to Native women, specifically the Haudenosaunee, because that's what I was able to find.
History is not what happened, it's who tells the story. These women had to see something that told them that it was possible.
My grandma would say, we're not feminists, we're the law.
The next image you see is by John Cahonas Fadden, who is of the Turtle Clan of the Mohawk Nation. This painting, English title is Womankind. Pre-contact Haudenosaunee Iroquois woman figure superimposed over planet Earth, our mother, with stars in the dark sky. Her right hand holds one corn representing the fact that the women were the stewards of the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, the sustainers. In her left hand, she holds a deer antler, symbol of chieftainship, and that the women, clan mothers, nominated the chiefs. The wampum strings give her that authority. The image of the fetus speaks of the fact that the clan follows the mother, the progenitor, with the oldest mother having the authority to give the child's name. The grandmother moon from the creation story is in the sky beyond. The next image is of a ceramic pot that came from Lake Champlain. This is in the entryway of the Clinton County Historical Association. And when I saw that, my assumption is that probably a woman or women made it. I could be wrong, but I just want to show there are traces of women in artifacts that we need to look at in different ways sometimes. This is a beaded picture frame. I bought it at an antique store about 20 years ago in Plattsburgh. It's definitely Haudenosaunee design. And so again, this is a trace of women doing art here in this land. Melanated Adirondacks, Phyllis, Black Maria, and Queenie. For time's sake, I may not get through all three of them, but I'll start with Phyllis. The Atlantic Ocean, Long Island Sound, Treadwell Bay. Water frames the life of Phyllis, born in the 18th century in Guinea. Human trafficked during the transatlantic slave trade, given by her mother to her master on the occasion of his first marriage, a refugee twice who fled Smithtown, Suffolk County, Long Island, and Old Plattsburgh from the British during the American Revolution, a pioneer settler of the wilderness in the forests of Beekman Patent. Phyllis, no surname written on her tombstone. Only Phyllis, like the celebrity she remains, a founding mother of 10, a nation-building American whose name crests like a white cap in the wash of all those names lost, omitted, or waiting for discovery, of those held in bondage in the Atlantic world on the Adirondack coast. The most gleaned of her life is through the lens of those she lived with, worked for, breathed air with, like her enslaver, the Honorable Thomas Treadwell, born February the 6th, 1743 at Smithtown, Suffolk County, Long Island. Before King Cotton, there was Queen Sugar, and it made Long Island, particularly the old families of the Hamptons, rich, very rich. They grew sugar cane all over the Caribbean plantation, so much so they established provisioning plantations on Long Island to grow foodstuff for their enslaved labor force, according to Donna Marie Borns and David Rattray, co-directors of the Plain Sight Project. The Treadwells, however, were speculators interested in land, settlement, timber, sawmills, and paper mills. A Princeton graduate, Judge Thomas Treadwell, studied law under Chancellor Robert Livingston. Thompson, in his History of Long Island, says of Treadwell, he was one of the most useful men of his time. He was well educated and distinguished for firmness and prudence during the difficult and trying period of the Revolution. He was almost constantly engaged in public business, was a member of the Provincial Congress from 1771 with power to establish a new form of government. He was a member of the first Senate of the state under the Constitution and seems in all respects to have been fitted for the perilous times in which he lived. The Honorable has a long, illustrious record, but this lens is turned on the private man, husband, father, friend, the one Phyllis saw. He married Ann Hazard, 23rd October 1765, and of their 13 children, several died in infancy. Anne passed away on the 6th of January 1743. 7 years later, he married his second wife, the widow, Mrs. Mary Conklin Hedges. Judge Treadwell's familiar temperament was large-minded and large-hearted. He was the wise, prompt counselor of the perplexed and is ready to grasp the hands of the children who loved him. His portrait by an itinerant painter captures an enigmatic man wearing an eye patch. His countenance is inscrutable, though one senses much stirs within. Treadwell was one of the proprietors of the old Plattsburgh patent drawing 900 acres. He sent his surveyor's son, Nathaniel Hazard, to pick out a plum spot for him, a 5,000-acre domain known then as St. Armand's Bay, that bears his name. At Smithtown, the family was driven from their home by marauding British soldiers, and there the beloved mother was stricken with paralysis. Phyllis was an eyewitness to all of these tumultuous events. Maybe she was the midwife delivering the Treadwell babies. Maybe she soothed Mrs. Treadwell with the loss of each infant. Maybe she was the nursemaid taking care of the children. Since Mrs. Treadwell and Phyllis were pregnant much of the same time, maybe Phyllis even served as a wet nurse, her milk allowing her enslaved children to live. Perhaps Phyllis was the cook, preparing massive meals for the Treadwell's large family, as well as a bigger cohort of African descent held in chattel slavery. It was about 1794 that Honorable Thomas Treadwell left the scenes of public life to which he had been so long accustomed and removed to the new region, settling on a heavily timbered tract of land at the foot of the beautiful bay. St. Armand's, afterwards known as Treadwell's Bay. It is an interesting incident that he brought some 40 slaves who were subsequently emancipated and colonized by Judge Treadwell on the high region, a few miles northwest. As the Honorable was a pioneer, so was Phyllis and her kith and kin. Even by Long Island standards, 40 enslaved people is a massive labor force to clear timber, erect buildings, met charcoal, lye, and potash. His interests included a dam and mill on the Saranac and the Republican newspaper. This 30th December 1831 account offers a glimpse of life on the bay. At his homestead on the state road 4 miles north of Plattsburgh and overlooking Treadwell's Bay, the Honorable Thomas Treadwell died at the age of 84. The old house was taken down in 1870 or 71, and its timbers used in the erection of a house near Ellenbrook on the Moffett Road. The boards used in the old structure were very wide. In fact, wide enough for a door. One of these, still preserved, has in it a porthole through which the master was wont to oversee the work of his slaves in the fields of the estate. Judge Treadwell built 2 homes on the bay. The first one closer to the lake shore was pillaged and torched on the 1st of August, 1813 during Colonel Murray's raid. The second home was a log house with a broad hall in the center. On each side were large square rooms. On the north side were the apartments of the colored people, while on the south side of the hall were the family rooms. Judge Treadwell's granddaughter, Mrs. Letitia P.T. Wells of St. Andrews, Quebec, wrote in her 82nd year, "When I was a child, I used to sit on his knee and read the Bible to him. He was a bright old gentleman, so kind to me, and had a pleasant twinkle in his eye. Unfortunately, he had but one, his left eye being pierced with a twig from a tree when he was riding through the woods, when quite a young man. He was a fine horseman and kept a nice saddle horse. It was an amusement he was fond of. And often in his 70s, he would ride up to Plattsburgh Village from his lakeside home. I used to make a visit 3 or 4 weeks at a time at the bay, stand at the door and see him mount and watch at the gate for his return." The story that is handed down by Treadwell descendants, historians, and columnists is that Treadwell freed his slaves and gave them land. In the 1960s, Plattsburgh State sophomore Gerald Sadler's research published in A Look Backwards at Old Plattsburgh states, Treadwell, in setting his slaves free, except one Phyllis, erected log houses and granted land to those who wished to remain in his locality. Small farms were located on the south side of the road on the Chazy Bigmantown Road. This is a trigger warning because where Black people lived within the North Country in this region, it was the N word wherever they lived. I'm not saying it, I'm just gonna say the N Hill Road. The 4-mile-long road is the one referred to as N Hill Road. Negroes who lived there on farms allocated by Treadwell and died there were buried in the Ingraham Cemetery in unmarked graves. Excuse me, I need to drink some water. "20 years earlier, 20 years earlier, Fuller Allen, writing in the same column, states, Thomas Treadwell, lot 112 of Bigman's Patent. Whoa. Sorry. Hit the wrong thing. Bigman's Patent, which is the southwest intersection of the Patnode and Fournier Road in what was then the town of Plattsburgh, but now is the town of Bigmantown, just south of the town of Chazy. In 1796, he deeded lot 112 to his daughter Anne Treadwell. However, either forgetting or ignoring this deed to his daughter, he proceeded in 1801 to deed part of this property to a colored man called York, who was a freeman. Anne Treadwell apparently married Isaac C. Platt, and in 1811 deeded a 21-acre parcel in lot 112 to Josiah Hick, a freed Negro, for $74.64, and in 1812 a 10-acre parcel to Caesar, a free Black man, for $40. Therefore, it may be concluded that Patnode Road is the true and original N Hill Road. Sadler also states that this road is reported to have been a stopping off place for fugitive Negroes, and Judge Treadwell's home was a station of the famous Underground Railroad. Here they were fed, clothed, and given aid in reaching their destination. In the Essex County Republican, June 26, 1890, in an article remembering the Treadwells, is a passage, recollections of an old neighbor of Mr. John Ray of Bigmantown. As a boy, he used to frequent the hospitable Treadwell home. He remembers the colored servants of the household, and he knew the small colony of freed men and women provided by their old master with homes and little farms in rich land. This spot is now unlike what it was when the little colony was started, for its people are gone and the land is run down. Some of the descendants are still living, one or two in Burlington, Vermont. It is no longer known as Richland, but the less pleasant name of Duty or Inn Hill. It is situated about 1 mile west of the Brick Tavern on the State Road. In 1999, Guadalupe Vanderhorst Rodriguez took a deep dive in melanated histories with her 10 Americans of Clinton County, New York. On page 55, Guadalupe lists Phyllis and the family constellation of York freemen, who Thomas Treadwell freed on August 27th, 1794. His daughter Tamar was freed on May 22nd, 1798. Guadalupe writes, Phyllis, in parentheses, Freeman. It is not known if Freeman is her surname, but there is a Phyllis Freeman listed in the 1850 Clinton County, New York census. In Down 7 Generations, a rescript of Treadwell and Platt genealogy, Mrs. A.C. Maltby, Treadwell's great-granddaughter, writes, some preferred remaining in the family, but several families accepted land and began the world for themselves. Their little community was called Rich Land. It was a few miles from their old home, and their old master continued to advise and encourage. Their numbers cannot be ascertained, but they were industrious and respected by all who knew them or had dealings with them. Few men were ever more trusted than Hicks and his wife Jen, or Saya and Cynthia, or appeared better as they made their annual visit at the Bay. Judge Treadwell's granddaughter, Mrs. Letitia P.T. Wells, wrote in her 82nd year, I remember the blacks in grandfather's kitchen and how afraid I was of them, their white teeth and white eyes, though they were always good to me. In later years, the younger ones of Richland used to make us an annual visit at Plattsburgh about Huckleberry time. And mother had parcels for the needy in the way of clothing, etc., laid away for them. In an account dated August 6, 1960, County Historian Margaret Hayes responds to an inquiry to the origins of Inn Hill Road. The slaves were eventually freed when Treadwell died, and they continued to live in the cabins in that area. The road they lived on became known in the 1820s as Inn Hill Road. The Negroes have since died off or moved to other places. The winters were too cold for them. There are old cemeteries up there that contain graves of some of these old slaves. This is a shot of Richland, part of the land up there. Richlanders may be buried in unmarked graves in the Ingraham Cemetery or rest for eternity beneath fieldstones in Richland. But Phyllis's tombstone and its inscription are legendary. Old Phyllis, the slave was of African birth and she died long, long ago. And her last request as she passed to her rest was, lay me at old master's feet. How am I doing for time?
So far, so good, Robin. I think you have time to go for, describe Queenie's experience.
Okay, let me go to Queenie. We're going to skip Black Maria. At first glance, Quinoa, Queenie, Minifield, Davis, Simmons' life as a maid to the well-heeled set in the Adirondacks appears as a northern equivalent of the Help. But Queenie's bodacious life and backstory is a richly textured American story. Her patrilineal heritage is a quick sketch of her father, Wallace, who may or may not have been an ex-slave, who may or may not have been from the antebellum South or New York City. He was a stonemason on record as building the Church of the Assumption in Redford, New York, and the First United Methodist Church of Saranac Lake. His fluidity in applying his artisan skills for diverse projects is a metaphor for Queenie's identity that is recorded as white, colored, mulatto, and Negro by census takers. Queenie grew up in Vermontville, a hop, skip, and a jump from self-emancipator John Thomas's rise and fortunes and freedom in Bloomingdale, far from his enslavement in Queen Anne's County, Maryland. Certainly, the Thomas and Minifield families knew each other in their neck of Franklin County. But as Mr. Thomas's story offers the happy ending of a former Garrett Smith grantee, Queenie's parallel story offers a glimpse of free people of color navigating and disrupting the societal norms and ideals about class, identity, and gender in the Adirondacks and Champlain Valley. It's her mother, Cornelia Tankard, who is the gateway to New England and the founding of this nation. Cornelia was the daughter of William and Eliza Mastic Tankard, who farmed in Beekmantown in a swath of land known as Inn Hill. This is a different part of Beekmantown. Wherever Black people lived, they got called the Inn Hill, wherever they lived. William was the son of George and Isabel Soper Tankard. George was the brother of Martin Tankard, the famous melt master at the Crown Glass Works in Redford, New York. Whoops. George and Martin were early settlers in Plattsburgh, noted as mulatto and of Manchester, Vermont birth. Both George and Martin were farmers, but it's Martin's skill in glass that leads to a line of inquiry of how he learned such a specialized trade that offers success to his practitioners, such as Martin's son, Thomas Henry, who was listed as a glassmaker in a Burlington census. L. Diana Carlisle states in her treatise on the Champlain Glass Company that glassmaking was a skill often passed from father to son. Did Martin perhaps learn the skill from his father, or was he an apprentice of John Foster, who was the superintendent for both the Champlain Glass Company and the Crown Glass? It begs the question, who was Martin and George's father? It was George Tankard, who fought in the 5th Connecticut Regiment during the American Revolution. He most likely earned his freedom the same way as Josiah Hasbrook and Jeffrey Brace by fighting for the Patriots' cause. Whoops. This was another road to freedom as perilous as the one taken by John Thomas and many like him, and explains why George, Jr. and Martin were born free so early on in the beginning of the 19th century. Connecticut had very restrictive Black codes, and it's little wonder that George Sr. sought opportunity and a less prescribed freedom in Vermont and New York. The Tankard's constant quest for opportunity illuminates migration patterns in the Atlantic world from New England westward. Queenie's ancestral stories can be viewed in the context of colonial nation building and their audacious attempt to live the American dream. In her Lake Clear home, she had a collection of antiques, perhaps pieces of Redford and Champlain glass. Queenie's lineage offers a more expansive discourse on work, migration, gender, and place, and transferences across Lake Champlain to its opposite shores. There's a lot more of New England, New York than is credited, hence the place of Queenie's birth, Vermontville. As Queenie was a pistol-packing mama, This petite woman's exercise her Second Amendment rights and Harlem Renaissance exploits belie her inglorious burial in an unmarked grave in Saranac Lake's Pond Ridge Cemetery. Queenie was a remarkable woman with a remarkable pedigree. She is a daughter of the Adirondacks as well as a daughter of the American Revolution.
Thank you so much, Robin. Now we'll have Sandra Weber come into the program.
Hi, and I'm gonna pick up where Robin kind of left us off there. What an amazing amount of research you've done, Robin. And we know that's what it takes, especially when you're researching women, because the history of the Adirondacks has been dominated by white masculine narratives. And just to demonstrate that, in case you don't believe me, where did I go? Here we are. There we go. So, for example, I was looking for Anna Newman, who was a single woman who was a farmer outside of Lake Placid. She owned what is now the Heaven Hill Farm. And so, just for example, here's a biographical review of the leading citizens of Essex and Clinton counties for 1896. And in the index, I counted about 200 men whose biographies are included here, and only 6 women. So first of all, you have to find anything about women. And then when you do find something about women, here's the passage for Anna Newman. And everything I have X'd out there isn't actually talking about Anna Newman, it's talking about her male relatives. So even when you go and find a woman, you don't tend to find out a lot about her, for example. So it's a lot of work, it's a lot of research to find information about women. So the conventional thinking then is that women had very little involvement in the wilderness, and they had no voice in shaping the wilderness or in preserving it. So if we exclude the women's voices, what do we miss? Here's what we miss. For example, here's a woman's voice. Here in the wilderness, folks will tell you to be careful about the place you live, for there's something in the mountains and the hills that is stronger than people, and you will grow like the place where you live. The hands of the mountains reach out with bindings that hold the heart forever. And I think one of the most profound statements ever made about the Adirondacks was made by a woman. And that statement is, the moral of the Adirondacks is freedom. So these are women's voices. Why don't we hear more of the women's voices? Well, for example, in the histories of the Adirondacks, here's one written in the 1990s. And the author says, I want to find out how the wilderness affected those men. And by those men, he's referring to the literate white men who are coming and roughing it in the Adirondacks, for a week or two. But in quotes, the author says, before the Civil War, very few women went camping for recreation. Well, if you know that women, there actually were some women, wouldn't you want to hear those voices? But generally, no, the men's voices are what analyzed. And there were women's voices. There was Lady Amelia Murray. There was Mrs. Lawson, who climbed Mount Marcy. There was Annie Brown, who camped on top of Whiteface Mountain. There was Mrs. Arnold and her 10 daughters living out in the wilderness. And there were the Black women of Timbuktu and other Black women, as Robin was just talking about, that don't get talked about in that time period before the Civil War. So what happens after the Civil War? Just a few years after the Civil War, in 1869, a woman comes along and she takes an outdoor adventure and she has a lecture and articles, and that woman is Kate Field, and she brings 3 women friends along with her, and they go fishing and hunting and camping, and they climb mountains. And after the adventure, she says, "Let me say to women that they can go anywhere and do anything. Helter skelter, off with silks and linen gloves and linen collars, and on with bloomers and stout boots and felt hat. And we so-called helpless women are transformed into helpful human beings." So Kate Field and her friends had a great time. However, sportsmen such as Thomas Banks Thorpe, what did they have to say about this? He said, "We do not consider the Wildwoods a place for fashionable ladies of the American style. And now the wilds have been invaded by Miss Kate Field, who uses her womanly imagination to soften the wilderness. Let the ladies keep out of the woods, even such male ladies as Miss Field." So he believed that the woods and the wilderness were certainly a place for men to be testing their manliness, that American women had nothing in their education that would prepare them to appreciate nature, and they also were not capable of physical exercise. Wow. So, whoops, sorry about that. So here's Kate Field, and here's Thomas Banks Thorpe. I'm not sure who looks more capable of physical exercise there, but I think it's Kate Field. So Kate Field had something to say back to Thorpe. She said, "If several hundred men think that the life-giving principles of the North Woods was instituted for the benefit of a few guns and rods, well, they are sadly mistaken." Kate Field promoted an anti-elitist, a democratic use of the woods. And she also was really ahead of her time. She also promoted what today we would call a leave no trace ethic in the woods. She complained that Thorpe and other men cleared 18 to 20 feet of the woods to build a shanty, and Field advocated using tents. She said, "It is cruel to stab a tree to the heart merely to secure a small strip of bark. It is ungrateful to destroy the pine and balsam that have given us our beds of boughs and fanned us with their vital breath. Let there be tents." So let's jump ahead 100 years to 1964. 1964, the great camps are gone. Many of the wealthy families are not vacationing in the Adirondacks anymore. There aren't many jobs. The economy is very depressed. So who's to blame for all this? Well, according to one male, the part of the blame goes to the new equality of women. He said that Eastern summer vacationers had been turning more and more to the Hamptons, the Jersey Shore, Cape Cod, Nantucket, and the beach was winning out over the woods. Mountains were no longer cheap. The forms of recreation the mountains offer, hunting, fishing, canoeing, hiking, camping, have always been those that appeal more to males than to females. I say hogwash to that. The belief that the Adirondacks are more appealing to men than women, well, we just talked about Kate Field. That certainly wasn't true, and she wasn't like the exception to the rule. So let me mention some more. We had Lottie Tuttle and her daughters Kit and Edie, who were in the Old Forge area in the early 1900s, and Lottie Tuttle was supposedly the first licensed woman guide. She was also a painter, a writer, a trapper. She did hunting and fishing, etc. Also, Julia Burton Preston was another one of the early women guides. She was born in Paseco to a local woman and an Indigenous man of Cree descent from Canada. At a young age, she learned to shoot a .22 caliber rifle, and she learned hunting skills from her father. She did not fear the physical environment, as is sometimes said about women, But she went out hunting, and she didn't really hunt as a recreation. She hunted to survive, to eat. She also became a guide, she said, not because of anything like feminism or anything, but simply because she needed to make a living. Now, another woman, Jean Robert Foster. She also grew up in the Adirondacks, but rather than hunting and fishing, she guided tourists up mountains to show them the beauty of the Adirondacks. And at a young age, she had a very spiritual attachment to a mountain, Crane Mountain. And she would lean up against that mountain and feel a force coming through her, a wild, untamed, beautiful force. And she grew up very poor. Later, she became a very world famous model, poet, writer. She hung out with all the famous writers and such of the time. And her poems tell the harsh truth of life in the mountains. Not only about hunting and farming and fishing, but also about poverty, religion, foolish love, and death. And she especially revealed what life was like for some of the women in the mountain. And I'm just gonna give you one example of a woman she wrote about called Ms. Cole. And Ms. Cole became tired of cooking and mending and being hands and feet for George and her 5 children. She felt that she had nobody, and that she had not a single thing to call her own, not even a hair ribbon. So one day she just got up and walked off to Pottersville. Excuse me, she walked off to Pottersville. She said she didn't know where she'd go, but it didn't matter. Now she was free. So the points of just these couple of examples here are that there are lots of women's voices out there, and that women were involved in many different aspects, and they did have a sense of belonging in the wilderness. So you know, why are they left out? When we talk about, for example, the creation of the Adirondack Park, there were women involved in that. There were women who spoke about that. For example, the Essex County Republican made this statement: Miss Kate Field should be foremost in the hearts of the citizens of Essex County, for she was among the first to agitate the question of the preservation of the forests of the Adirondacks. Not only did she talk about preserving the forest and conserving the water, she believed in preserving the region for health and recreation. And she wrote that the Adirondack Mountains were intended by nature to be the eastern pleasure ground of the United States. That was quite an astounding idea at that time. And it's interesting that when the park was actually established in 1892, that the wording was for the free use of all the people for their health and recreation, exactly the same ideas she was promoting. Kate Field really had a complete vision for the park of forest preservation, water preservation, health, recreation, social justice. She bought the John Brown Farm in 1870 with some friends, and then in 1896 she gave it to be part of the New York State Forest Preserve. And so really this was the birth of historical or cultural preservation in the Adirondack Forest Preserve, and a woman was behind it. When we talk about stewardship of the mountains, I'm just going to try to get through this very quickly. There I would specifically talk about Grace Hudowalski, who founded the Adirondack 46ers. She was an amazing woman. You know, people tend to think of 46ers as being people who just run up the mountains, but that's not at all what the idea was that started with Grace. She had the motto that it's not important to reach the summit, it's about making the climb, and that your climbs are worth writing about, you know, thinking about what you learned from it. Grace also was a great writer, wrote many articles in different periodicals, even worked for the DEC Communications for a while. And she always promoted, care of alpine vegetation, trail maintenance, summit stewardship, picking up litter, education, etc. And it's wonderful that a couple of years ago, finally, we had a second high peak named for a woman, right, which was Grace. In terms of healthcare, taking the health cure in the mountains, tuberculosis patients who were women often were not given the same cure that men were given. Women were also often just given months of rest in bed and operations. And this is what was done for Martha Rebin in 1927 when she came here. And she saw an ad in the newspaper for going out into the woods and spending the summer in the woods to take the health cure in the woods. And she was the only one to respond to that ad. Sometimes, if you're familiar with her story, sometimes we don't think about that, but no men replied to that ad to actually go out in the woods for summer to try to cure their tuberculosis. But she did. It worked for her. She got healthier. She learned to interact with the wildlife, and she wrote books about it. And she talked about how it not only healed her disease, but living in the woods taught her fortitude and self-reliance and an appreciation of the natural world. There are so many others I could mention here. I'm going to try to wrap this up quickly. Women were also greatly involved with the formation of communities and with social and racial justice. Of course, there were many women involved with suffrage, women's suffrage in the area, and even famous women came here. Susan B. Anthony, Anna Howard Shaw came and vacationed in the Adirondacks. Of course, Inez Mulholland spent much of her time here, and Inez became the martyr of the women's suffrage movement. Women were also involved very early on in abolition in this area. In the mid-1830s, Catherine Keyes, a Quaker woman in Peru, she formed the Peru Female Anti-Slavery Society. And when they held a big convention in 1837, 200 women came to that anti-slavery convention. Quite remarkable. I mean, this is still the same time that Lucretia Mott is doing the same thing in Philadelphia. Quite amazing. Also, many women were involved in the John Brown Memorial Association in talking about racial equality and civil rights in the 1920s through the 1980s. And two women in particular, Inez Carter and Eva Franklin Durand, were very involved in that. They lived in Lake Placid, and they both actually became officers of the National Association. So great involved, very, very, very involved in that effort. So I very quickly run through a lot of things that women were doing here. Women's voices, I could give you a lot more quotes. There's so much more to learn. I guess I want to make just a concluding point here. So there obviously were women who pushed back against the constraints of the gender norms, and that they experienced the Adirondacks. They were here from the very beginning, as Robin points out, in the 1700s. And it doesn't matter whether they were born here or raised here or only visited here or they moved here, they all played a part in the history, in the heritage of the Adirondacks. And their voices are all very important and part of the Adirondack history. And I also want to say that women, gender is only one part of identity. And women are not homogeneous any more than any other groups are. And I hesitate to continue to do presentations such as this one that just talk about women. because we can't put people into silos. And we're talking about like half the population of the country here. Why are we putting them in a silo? Why are we putting women's history and African American history and Indigenous history? Why are we talking about them in separate places? Because all of this history, it's all integrated together. These things are happening at the same time. These people were interacting with each other. As we've mentioned, like, you know, they had a local woman for a mother and a Cree descendant for a father. And so we can't, like, people are not, there's not one facet to people. And I really think it's time that we start integrating these things and that we start talking about Adirondack history, because these are all Adirondack history. They shouldn't be talked about separately. They're not separate histories. They're Adirondack history. Okay, I'm done now. I'm done. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sandra, and thank you, Robin, as well. There's a question in the Q&A I wanted to pose to Sandra really quickly. Then I have a question, and then I would invite audience members to please feel free to type some questions into the Q&A, and then we can put those to our wonderful speakers. But there was one person, Sandra, who was wondering, you know, a list of the books you've written and other books you'd recommend. And I would just say Sandra has a website that she can tell you what that is right now, so that she can give you a reading list, perhaps. Oh, you're muted, Sandra.
There. SandraWeber.com is my website. But yes, but, you know, look at Breaking Trail, look at, also, I highly recommend Kate Winter's book, Woman in the Mountains, which was an inspiration for me, that talked about women writers in the Adirondacks.
Great. So I have a question for both of you while we maybe wait for some other folks to type in some questions, and please feel free to do so. But what struck me about both of your presentations is that we have examples of women negotiating physical boundaries, navigating the boundaries between enslavement and freedom, navigating the physical geography of the Adirondacks, a remarkable degree of mobility that we wouldn't typically associate with women who are limited by, you know, the horrors and the brutality of enslavement or otherwise, or the dominant cultural values about what is expected of them, as sort of Sandra has described. So I wonder if both of you could just talk a little about how you understand the women in your story negotiating physical boundaries and negotiating ideological boundaries that are really kind of trying to lock them into a certain expectation of what they should and should not be doing in the Adirondacks, if that makes sense.
Do you want me to start, Robin?
Yes, because I'm still processing what he said. Go ahead.
I am too. It's a lot to take in. I had an answer, now I forgot it. I think I'm not sure that the things they faced in the Adirondacks were a lot different than they were facing in general. Like, one of the things I learned that I didn't get a chance to say during my presentation is that women in New York State could not, if you were married, you couldn't own property. So think about that. If you couldn't even own land, and we talk a lot about this with Timbuktu, of Black men not being able to own land, but if you can't even own land, then how does that form your relationship with land? That has to, like, just affect your whole psyche of, it's something that I can't even access. And so, you know, and that was really, you know, the whole case of that, you know, women didn't have their own rights, you know, and Black women didn't have their own rights, and, you know, not even having the right to vote until 1917, right? So there's those barriers of what is your place, absolutely, right? You're not, you're a second-class citizen still. But it's interesting that one of the things I ran into especially in the Adirondacks, about women going out into wilderness and such, is the dress, right? Is their clothing, simply their clothing of what they had to wear, which was a big obstacle of going out in the woods.
Great.
I don't know if I got at that question very much, but.
And Robin, what about women, sort of some of the women that you talked about navigating that, what we would think for a time is a very difficult boundary to surmount between enslavement and freedom? What do you think it was about the Adirondacks that makes that story unique?
Well, it goes to the founding of not only New York State, but of this country. They were there on the ground from the beginning. I mean, there was a wilderness here when they came. So they were pioneers, so it was difficult. So for me, they are inspirational. And it's interesting because there's one woman, Josiah Hick, who owned land. Actually, his daughter, because I was pulling deeds in the real property in the courthouse. And so his daughter actually at one point owned his land. She did own his land. So it passed from her dad to her, I think her name was Cynthia. So there are some of these women who do become land owners. And like Queenie did also. I mean, I think she, through marriage, because her first husband, Dana Davis, and one thing I need to say about Queenie's mother, Queenie's grandmother was white and her grandfather was, well, they were mixed race. They were mixed race people. And the thing is, some people say, what happened to these people? I know this off on a tangent. What happened to these people is because they became white. There are present day people, descendants here, who descend from these people who are white. Some of them are aware of this history, some are not, but there are still people here remain, and then others, they did leave, they went wherever they went. But I think for Phyllis, I mean, because they had the conflicting stories about, was she free, was she not? He freed all the slaves, but he didn't free Phyllis. But then when New York State did pass this freedom, was she free? I'm not sure. That's like a ambiguous state, you know, with Phyllis. I'm not sure what to make of her situation. And the fact that it was her request that she be passed at her be buried at her master's feet. And I'm thinking, are we getting into like a Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson scenario? Like, what is going on?
Yeah.
She had 10 kids. Who was the father of her kids? I mean, Guadalupe thinks it might have been, you know, I guess it was York Freeman, but, you know, I don't know. I don't know. So I have more really questions than I have answers. So really, I can't answer your question because I have more questions than I have answers with doing this. So, but I think that are there any archaeologists out there? We need to do archaeological dig at Richland. It's like we need to go find out what we can find.
Someone else would like to know, Robin, do you have a website? Is there a way that some of the audience members can get in touch with you to learn a little bit more about this information? Or
I don't have, no, I had a website. I haven't looked at it for a while. I mean, the best place to reach me is at the Press Republican. That's it. Because I do these short dives and they end up in the paper or whatever. One day when I retire, maybe I write books. I'm not there yet.
Great.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much to you both, Robin and Sandra, for your presentations. And as I think you've really pointed out, that it's difficult work to try to sort of dig through the historical record to find evidence and stories of women's contributions, experiences, and perspectives, not just in the Adirondacks, but really throughout the nation. And it's really important work. And what I'm seeing from the chat here is people just so appreciate hearing these stories. And having these, women's contributions really highlighted by both of you and promoted in this way. So thank you so much to you both. I would just note that I put the link to our next program in the chat, and that will air 2 weeks from this evening, July 26th at 7 p.m. It's titled Indigenous Perspectives on Adirondack Park, Knowledge and Practice. So we hope you'll join us for that program. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. Thanks one more time to Sandra and Robin, and we hope to see you again in 2 weeks. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Right.